and welcome to the Service Operations Podcast. I am your host, 𝗦𝗲𝗏𝗃𝗀𝗃𝗀. Our guests are from different industries and functions. They will share their experience, strategies, and the changing landscape to help you take the service operations of your business to the next level. Welcome, Hari, to the Service Operations Podcast. Thank you for your time for this conversation. Hari has spent about over 15 years in operations, risk, and customer service. And if one has to do a root cause analysis, Hari can go down to the last atom and find what the problem is. So that's the best way that I can describe you. And having set up service in 2 startups, and also having gone through the evolution of credit cards in the early days, take us through your journey as well as how exactly did you do the setup, because a setup in a startup is what we are looking to listen to you.
Thanks, ma'am. Thanks for the intro. That was kind of you to remember the earlier days in terms of how we've handled service, and happy to have been part of the unit which worked on this earlier days in the bank. I've spent more than 15 years in operations, in customer service, and in risk, predominantly on the payment space, both on the issuing side and the acquiring side of the payments business. Yes, was fortunate to set up the operations and customer service in a couple of startups. Basically, the evolution that happens typically is you use the growth of operations or customer service typically is a 0 to 1, where you're trying to build the product, a 1 to 10 in terms of handling the initial interactions with customers, both in terms of their association with the product and their experience with the product. And 10 to 100 is basically the scale, building it for scale. So in the bank, it was more of a 10 to 100 because the initial setup was already done, and hence it was more of building it from a 10 to 100 kind of a scale. But in the startup, you get the experience in terms of handling it from a 0 to 1 and a 1 to 10 experience. So that way, I think I've seen all the 3 cycles. So would be happy to share my experiences in terms of how a service setup is designed and is thought about, and we went about how did we implement it in my last meaning in the couple of startups that I worked with.
Okay, that's great. Let us know what is the kind of thinking you do first. There is something that you would think of, and specifically in a startup, you are it's not a standard setup, as in, you don't at this point know what your volume is going to be, what kind of customer you're going to have. So you first tell us about this whole thinking phase of starting.
Perfect, man. I think you gave the right connector to the discussion. Typically, in the thinking stage, there are 3 stages in which we go about doing it. One is first, what is our CX strategy? I call it as customer experience rather than limiting it to only customer service.
Yeah.
So, one is what is the customer experience strategy? From the strategy, basically evolves the structure, and from the structure comes the people. So basically, we start with what is it we want to achieve in our customer experience strategy. In the customer experience strategy, typically the evolution has been in terms of not just thinking of a service unit, because service unit is the last part. I would put 4 pillars to a customer experience strategy. The first pillar is basically to say how would you define or design your products in such a way where there would be customer interactions which are minimal, meaning customer need not look at having any point of exception where he needs to reach out to somebody for a support. So this I would call it as an issue prevention pillar, where how do I define my product and processes in a way that it does not create issue for a customer. A simple example could be that I've defined a method in which customer can repay their credit card outstanding, and have I created a backup payment gateway as well, so that even if the payment gateway 1 fails, there is a gateway 2 that will get initiated. And that becomes part of the strategy in designing to say that how can we avoid an issue. That is an issue prevention pillar. The second pillar of that is, in spite of all the planning onto it, certain issues do happen.
I was coming to that.
Yeah. So yeah, meaning it's a fallout. So I'm sure that we cannot envisage certain issues, or even if we envisage, we may not get that from day one. So after issue prevention, there will still be issues that will happen. If that issue happen, then the customer is at a point of exception. And in that scenario, how is that I can create a case where it is a ticket prevention? A ticket means an interaction with the company. How is that can be prevented? Okay, that is the second pillar in which we think in the product itself, where at the point of failure, what is that can be communicated to the customer, where the customer is aware of what am I expected to do next. Simple example could be that customer tried to make a payment. I'll take the same example. Customer tried to make a payment, and customer made a payment, and the payment failed. Okay, so now what is that the customer needs to do at the point of failure? Okay, has to be told to the customer. If it is being told in the journey, then you are eliminating, you are keeping that entire interaction itself in a flow to say that the customer knows that if in case the payment fails, what am I expected to do? And if my account has been debited, should I need to wait for a couple of days? Or if my account has not been debited, then can I reinitiate that payment? So we envisage the points of failure, and on that point of failure, if the customer were to tread that path, what is it the customer can do? So this basically is the interaction prevention, or I would call it as a ticket prevention pillar. Ticket prevention pillar typically is managed through proactive communication to the customer and handling it in the journey of the customer flow. Be it a transaction, be it a payment, be it a rewards redemption, everywhere, what could be points of failure? And in that point of failure, how do I handhold that customer? The third prevention, in spite of communication to the customer, we may be doing all proactive communication. Your payment has failed. It will take about, say, 5 days for the money to come back into your bank account. Could be a communication. But in spite of that, there would be customers who would have the apprehension in terms of what am I supposed to do next? Because there is money involved onto it. If there is money involved, and customers' anxiety levels are much higher. So their apprehensions are much higher. In that case, the third pillar, what we put in design thinking there is to create it as a automation, which is your entire interaction where customer would still interact with the company, but how is that can be made without any human intervention? That is the third pillar in which there are multiple tools, meaning the age-old tool was an IVR, which has gone through so much of growth. But the recent ones are basically bots or service bots, which gets an interaction to the customer on his handheld or on the web, where they get instant support, which is available. It could be a chat or it could be a bot. However, how is this service can be given without a human intervention? That is the third pillar. In spite of that, there will be customers who would want to reach out to somebody because it is money involved, or they need some reassurance to say that whatever has been told is going to happen. Okay, so the fourth pillar actually comes in terms of human handling, which is the actual service part, which where what we talk about a customer service, setting up the team, having a dialer, putting up a desk, having the people, giving them training, how do they handle knowledge. All these things are part of the fourth pillar, which is the human interaction with the consumer.
Wow.
So
really, simplified the entire large exercise into, small pieces. So we'll get into each one in a little bit of detail. Yeah. So Hari, you can tell us the details of each of the pillars which you have so neatly defined. You've simplified a very complex subject.
So, the four pillars that we set out, just a recap. One is issue prevention. The second one is ticket prevention. The third one is a ticket automation. And the fourth one, I call it as an effective resolution. How is that when a customer reaches out to a human, how is that we can give complete and correct resolution in the first time that goes with the consumer? So these are the four pillars to it. The first three pillars, I would call it as the CX design element, because these are not the actual interaction, these are the customer's interaction to the product. So this is the CX design element. And the fourth one is the CX ops element, which is where there is a human intervention. All our the age-old metrics that we have built in terms of first call resolution or an AHT handling, and all those things falls under the fourth bucket, which is the effective resolution for any customer who has landed up into our discussion area. So we'll start with the issue prevention segment. Yeah. If you have to understand what each of these pillars can do, we typically then look at what are the measurements that we will do against each of these pillars. So typically each of the pillars, then if you define what is that we will measure against this, so we'll start with measurements against each of these pillars, which are the measures that we will do. Basis the measures, then we go ahead in terms of looking at what is the tools that we would need to achieve those measurements. And basis the tools, then we start looking at our strategy in terms of which are the channels that we need to provide support to the consumer, which is our primary channel and which is our alternate channel. From there, what is our support timings, right? All these becomes inputs to the fourth pillar, which is the CX operations. So we start with what is the measurements that will help us in each of these pillars. So let me just take I'm not segregating between the first three pillars. All these three pillars fall under the CX design element. On the design element, the primary metric that today drives is basically a contact to transactions. If there are 100 transactions that has happened, the customers have done transactions onto it, how many customers end up contacting the service unit, which is the company, right? Because issue prevention, that's the first one. Issue prevention, because that is looking at an overall level. It is not tracking, it's looking at a portfolio and not looking at a particular interaction that has happened.
Mhm.
So the issue prevention and the issue resolution part of it, we look at CTT, which is contact to transactions ratio, which talks about if there are 100 transactions that has happened. Let's assume that a customer would come into an onboarding journey, right? They would go through the onboarding journey, get themselves onboarded, get a card issued, card or a loan, whichever is the product that is getting issued. Then they will have repeated exchanges that will happen with the company. Be it, say, in the case of a card, it would be they would do a rewards redemption, they would do a purchase transaction, they would do a
Yeah.
repayment, right? So they have X number of activities that they will do, and each is a point of interaction with the company, right?
Yeah.
And at each point of interaction, how is that we are ensuring that there is no need for the customer to contact or reach out? That becomes a measure to say that whether the product has been designed in a way where the contact to transactions ratio is on the lower side. So if there are
Okay.
100 transactions that has happened, what would be a right indicator? It depends upon the industry. Industry
Yeah.
wise, it varies. There would be certain industries where there is a higher apprehension, so there would be high touch point that would happen. But for certain products, there may not be high touch points. Touch point happens only at the time of onboarding, and subsequently, it is more in terms of like for a loan, there is not much high touch points for a consumer. Once the onboarding is done and the loan is disbursed to the consumer, after which
Yeah.
it's a monthly once activity in terms of the EMI being processed. And if there are any issues in the EMI, that is also an automated process where the customer is not initiating and customer gets intimation to the same. So typically the entire process depends upon the number of touch points that the customer has with the product. And hence a product with higher touch points will have a higher ratio with respect to a contact to transactions. And how do we address the contact is basically gets thinking into the journey of the consumer. A simple example that I can take is that same example of repayments. When a customer comes, what should the customer see in terms of repayments? Typically, in a credit card, the customer would have received the card statement on an email, and they will have to go and make a payment onto another bank's website or any other third-party page website that they would need to do. This is going to be a point of disconnect. How is that I can give that the customer can initiate a payment at the point of statement itself? So if I give that information, I'm not missing out on the customer having a follow to say that yeah, I have this statement and I can make a payment from the point at which I have seen the statement. This is a design element that comes in. And if the customer goes into the point at which he is initiating a payment, what is it the customer needs to do? He needs to know how much is this minimum amount due, what is his total amount due. He needs to do certain information which upfront gets available to a consumer. So we are basically thinking through the customer journey at each point and what could be a touch point for the consumer. How can we ensure that all these are readily available for the consumer to avoid that interaction? That becomes part of the journey.
Yeah, so I just have one quick question. When a customer is onboarding, because it's the first time the customer is doing it, and these are not age-old practices, because every product that a customer buys, the onboarding journey could be different. So it's not like
Yes.
he knows what to do. Now, at that point of time, the customer would need some kind of help.
Yes.
So how does that work in a fully automated scenario that you're talking about? Is there any intervention required?
Sure, ma'am. I get your question there. So the design element over there is to look at what are the points of failure in the onboarding journey. Okay, so at every point, where could be a customer getting dropped in my onboarding journey? Okay,
Okay.
the issue prevention is then thinking about how can I eliminate that point of failure. If you're creating, say, 10 steps that the customer need to complete, do I need to have all the 10 steps for the customer to get onboarded, or can I look at that the steps can be clubbed together to look at minimum number of steps? So
Yeah.
one line of thinking is to say how many hops can it be reduced. The second thinking over there is that do all the steps needs to be done in a sequential method, or can it be done certain activities in parallel? Because let's assume that we are working with getting some information from PAN services, getting some information from the bureau, getting some information onto it. If we keep it into a sequential method, then it goes saying that yeah,
Long.
one step has to be completed, then the next step starts. So there is a wait time for the consumer. How can we design the processes which can work parallelly, and at the point of decision we can take whether the customer gets qualified for giving a card or a loan, and or does it not, right? So basically in the design element itself we look at parallel or sequential processing and reducing the number of hops that would be needed for a consumer. A worst case scenario is that yes, I may not be able to onboard 100% of my customers through the flow. There will be fallouts that will happen in the step. At that point of failure, let's assume that a customer is doing a case of penny verification, right? So it is possible that the customer does not have, let's assume, say, his remember his bank account and IFSC for doing a penny verification as a process, right? So we are basically making him go out of the flow and then collect certain information and come back. This is a point of failure. Even if the transaction is not failed, the delay in terms of customer not having information in the flow itself is a point of failure. Exactly. We say that what is that which is much easier for them? A VPA or the UPI VPA is a much easier thing for the consumer to remember. It typically is mobile number at the rate whatever is the handle that we have. So that becomes a design element which will ensure that how can we give alternatives to the consumers where the customer is not moving away from our flow and staying within the flow. And in spite of that, if there is a failure, which becomes a point of failure, which I'm referring to, at that point, what is that? I will explain the customer to say that what is he supposed to do next? What is the call
Yeah,
to action?
that's
Yeah.
very important.
Yeah. So the call to action basically then is in terms of if the customer needs to wait and somebody from our end will have to look into it, let's tell the customer that you will have to wait for this and then we will come back to you. If the
Okay.
call to action is an alternative thing to say that, yeah, maybe the details that you've provided is a mismatch onto it, would you want to try with an alternate bank account on IFSC? Is another call to action. So we'll have to list down all the call to actions that can be given to the consumer, check what is the point of failure, and offer this as a solution to the consumer in the flow. Typically, the design is that you have transaction happening on one side and you will have customer service on another page, even there. So typically, customers would go into, okay, where is the contact us page? Where is the customer service
Yeah.
number which I need to reach out to, right? Providing that at the point of failure itself is a big
Yeah.
service to the consumer because he knows that what am I supposed to do next.
Exactly,
As you,
exactly. And this is very typical because, I mean, of course, you're talking about a fully automated or digitized process, but even in, hybrid processes, finding where to go is like one big, it actually, you made a point by saying that it should be at the place where the drop or the
exactly.
failure happens. Yeah, or the breakage happens.
Yes,
That's
ma'am.
really very,
Absolutely.
very valid. Yeah.
And then what we look at other metrics in terms of these are portfolio level metrics because these are not
Yeah.
individual interactions. The other metric which typically is being used now is an NPS as a metric, which is your net promoter score in different
Yeah.
forms, where you're looking at what is the percentage of your promoters as against your detractors to it, which is a simple method of giving a survey to the consumer and looking at what has been their affinity towards the program. That's overall not just linking it to the service element alone, because that feedback is looking at giving in consumers view on the entire business and the product, including the service. Yeah. This is one method at a design element which gets evaluated. The other element on the design element is what is the time taken from the time the customer had a query till the time they had a resolution. Okay, this of course is a in our parlance we call the TAT. The TAT is for not for actual resolution. For example, customer raised a ticket and when did we resolve the ticket is only a smaller measure. But looking at it from the end-to-end point to say that at what is the point of failure, two, then what is the point of resolution, what is the total time taken for us to handle that customer experience goes into the product. The CX ops element will only take care of it from the time customer raised a ticket to the time I have resolved it. Okay, there could be a percentage of customers who are not even raising a ticket, right? So if there are 100 customers who have got dropped in the onboarding journey, right? And out of that, let's assume say 10 customers raised an issue that I couldn't. The remaining 90 customers we lost, right? But how do I ensure that those 90 customers are also being brought into the entire journey for us to look at it is what is the entire end-to-end issue to resolution timeline. That gets looked at it from a product point of view, not just from a servicing point of view. Yes, of course, there are other smaller metrics that comes in, which are standard metrics that we have in terms of what is the cost of a channel, which channel do we use. These are standard ones that we always use. And what is the automation percentage out of the total number of queries that we receive? How many queries are being addressed without a human intervention versus with a human intervention? Right? The evolution of that automation is basically to say issues which have higher customer anxiety or apprehension, right? And issues which are complex in nature, at the point of failure itself, should be given a human resolution instead of the customer needing to go through automated steps and then having it. Because if you know that a particular issue type, for example, my bank account is debited, but my payment is not reflecting, is a high anxiety scenario for a consumer. So for that customer, can I give an online chat feature at that point in time rather than asking the customer to basically wait for 5 days or come back after some time, right? So this goes in the decisioning of what are the design elements that we have. Basis these design elements, then we get into the thought process to say that which is our primary channel. If you actually look at it, products which are app-based products typically would want to keep app as the primary channel for resolution. Because the journey is built into the app and then hence app can handle the entire experience. Products which have both app as well as web onto it will have multiple channels, but predominantly we need to define clearly which is our primary channel for service to the consumer, because most of your focus is going to go into that channel to build it effectively. Subsequent channels are also available in terms of coverage. Do I have an inbound call feature? Do I have an inbound email feature?
But it's avoidable.
It's avoidable.
So right? I think if things get solved, of course, it's customer education level is one point. But if things get solved at the same channel in which the customer is interacting, then only the drops will go to the other channels, and you really don't want him to go there in the first place.
Yes. How effective have we been able to design the point of failures and the customer support at the point of failure is the strength of the first three pillars that we spoke about. Now coming to the fourth pillar, which is the operations, CX operations pillar. There, time and tested metrics are available. It talks about call abandonment rate or number of interactions that has happened with a consumer to resolve a particular issue that the customer has. Is the customer reopening a particular issue that we have already resolved? How many times are they reopening that case? What is the case where there is the average response time from the customer raising it to be resolving it? How much time is it typically taking? These are the standard first call resolution. All these are standard metrics that most of the service units have already excelled, or they basically have tools where they can excel and then keep building onto it. But the entire tooling basically needs to be thought about in the product itself for the first three pillars. I think that's where the segregation comes in terms of, if you look at service as a unit, we have a dialer solution, we have a ticketing solution which is available, we have a bot, we'll have a chat feature which is available. All these are interactions which will sit in the fourth pillar, which is consumers' effective resolution. But what sits within the organization is the actual product. If we are able to design the product thinking the elements of issue prevention, ticket prevention, and ticket automation, the residue is what is going to go into an operations.
I have another question for you here. this is the first time setup. So for a moment, if we think that yes, we have done everything very perfectly, what is the way in which you are trying to find further, improvements in each of these?
Yes, ma'am. So yeah, I think so. This is at a strategy level as to what is the this strategy definition basically has an output. The output of that is that I would know which are the channels that I would want to offer to my consumer, and what is my service timings that will be available to it. Which is my primary
Yeah,
channel, and within the primary channel, what are the what to say metrics that I would track. This basically gets well defined with the first section. Subsequent to that, then we start looking at it to say that for each of these segments, what is the detailing or need that I should start with, right? So it basically starts with defining unhappy flows for consumers, right? What is an unhappy flow for a consumer has to be defined at each step in the product journey for a consumer. It could start from customer getting onboarded or even hearing about
before
us
that.
before that,
Hmm.
exactly.
Yeah.
So, what could be a unhappy flow for a consumer has to get defined. In the unhappy flow, then we are talking about how do I address an unhappy flow with multiple options to the consumer. This becomes the first starting point. The fallout of this exercise will basically lead into what is the customer education that I need to give, what is
Hmm.
the solutioning that I need to give to the consumer to say that do the customer need a self-help here, or do the customer need a bot solution here, or do we need a somebody to answer the customer or explain the customer for a scenario which needs a human intervention, right? So the entire journey starts with defining what are the unhappy flows and how do I prevent an unhappy flow, right? So when we define an unhappy flow for the consumer, then we are looking at which are the unhappy flows results into what are the points of failure. And points
Yeah.
of failure from there picks on to with respect to which are the areas that we need to start giving solutions to the consumers, right? From
Hmm.
here, then we move into what are the tools that we would need in terms of building this entire strategy, right? So
Okay.
we spoke about multiple components to this entire customer experience journey, right? So the basic thing would be to know that, yeah, I have a consumer, meaning I have a customer, and I know the details about the customer for which they may need to reach out to us, right? So having the basic information about the customer and at what point or what is the issue that the customer would have faced or what was his last interaction that has happened becomes the starting point for it, right? So all the tools that would be needed to do this, right from having an IVR in place or having an in-house dashboard which tells about
Hmm.
what are the consumer tickets that have come in, what is the customer stage which is there. These are some things which have evolved. There are a lot of third-party products that are available which help in terms of assisting existing customer experience unit for building these stuff. So we
Hmm.
basically then need to prioritize within that to say that which channel do we start with and which tool do we start with as a basic thing. This basically is more in terms of available products which can fit into our strategy, and from there
Yeah.
on build the exercise of having a full-fledged servicing unit.
So now the last bit is the customer service, the traditional style. When you are setting the process, the human intervention is not necessarily required at the last stage. You also need a human intervention maybe at the first, I mean, at every point. You don't need it, but you need to have it.
Yes, ma'am. I agree with you. Actually, the learnings that come over there is that in case there is a point of failure, what is the effective resolution for the point of failure is an open question. It need not be a case where I
Yeah.
would always give bot as a solution
Solution.
to the consumer. If a point of failure has higher CTT, that's where the
Hmm.
metric of CTT comes in, contact to transactions. Let's
Yeah.
take the example where customer is doing a transaction on which customer will get a statement. Okay,
Okay.
how many customers? So let's assume that I have sent statements to say 10 lakh consumers, and how many customers reached out to us, understanding what is there in the statement, right? This let's assume that this number
Yeah.
is
Hmm.
X. Okay, a typical thing that.
Typical. I'm so surprised that even today, we always presumed that a credit card user is one who always knows what to do. And in some websites, you still find terms like past statement, current statement, and it's so confusing because in savings account, it is very simple. You want statement for which month. Here
Correct.
you'll have billing cycle. I don't know. I don't know why we still use those terms, which we think that everyone knows.
Sure, yeah, I agree. Actually, understanding the customer, what the customer would interpret it as,
and especially the new customers, even 18-year-olds start using, I mean, they use banking completely,
Debit
and not
cards.
just banking, finance, borrowing, and those kind of things. And they are not the people who understand, what we all the kind of terms that are still in use. So I think this usage and simplifying the usage, the terms which the customer uses, it's very important.
Yes, ma'am. In fact,
That's a very important point. And now that we're talking about it, I'm also remembering, now earlier when we wrote emails also, it is dear so and so, and then you end it with whatever. But today, I mean, it's casual conversation, and you just start with hi, and you say what you want to say, and you're not building a context around it. And I think, yeah, you've really made a very good point that communication, whether you're in a digital world, whether you're in the physical world, whether you're face to face, has to be as simple and as minimal.
correct, minimal. Yes, ma'am. If you actually see, if you have standard responses that are there, we tend to skip the first two lines because we know that those are standard templates. We don't consume. We need what is the real message in terms of the resolution. As a customer, if I have reported for some issue and I'm expecting that has it been resolved and what is actual resolution that has happened. So the communication is towards in terms of yes, it has been resolved. That's the first message. And what is actual resolution is the second message.
Exactly.
Everything else
Exactly.
can wait in terms of template that we
It's
define.
not required. In the age where people don't want to spend so much time with each other, I think it's just not required.
Yes, ma'am. Absolutely. Yeah. I'll just pick up on scenarios with respect to the metrics that we spoke about. Yeah. On the consumer CX ops metrics that we spoke about, right? These are fairly evolved metrics that we already track, and these metrics are typically tracked to ensure the efficiency of the channel that is being set up, and in terms of effectiveness for the consumer. One big metric that we basically look at is the CSAT, customer satisfaction. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
A customer satisfaction where yes, it involves what is the customer's the resolution has been provided by the company. How is the customer's association to that resolution? Was it positive or was it negative? Is a key input for redesigning the elements which has already been set up, right? So
Okay.
one thing that we've clearly put importance on is that yeah, meaning in the current age, AHT has no relevance even if there are higher calls. If these are still exceptions that can be managed, right? But however, a CSAT is a non-compromisable metric. You might not have used a standard template. You might have not have addressed dear so and so sir or dear so
Yeah.
and so customer to it. As long as the customer is happy with the response that you've given, it takes care of the entire issue of whether completeness, correctness. So
Yeah.
CSAT as a response to the consumer is that moment of truth to say that the customer has been happy with the resolution provided. What takes it from there on is to figure out whether a customer who has had an issue and has been resolved, how has that customer's behavior with us in terms of subsequent business to the company been? That
Yeah.
becomes a real after evaluation to say that yes, people will have issues. The issues have been addressed. How soon, how completely, how quickly have we resolved those issues? After which, has their normalcy come in? Are the customers still doing transactions? Are they doing as much transactions as what they were doing earlier? Or are they doing more transactions than what they were doing? Or they completely switched off your app and then they're not using
Yeah.
the thing? Becomes a real metric for us to know that yes, whatever effort that has been put in is going on. So it's possible that the
Yeah.
customer has given a good CSAT. He was happy with the resolution, but he stopped using the card, right? It's not a good measure for us, right?
Yeah.
Because as an intermediate measure, he was happy with what we gave, but overall he wasn't having a great experience with the product. That
Yeah.
is where we start rethinking in terms of how do we bring these customers again into the fold to ensure that
Mm.
CSAT is not the only metric, NPS is not the only metric. How do we get the customer to transact is the real proof of the pudding.
Yeah. So one is, what I'm understanding you say is that you need to, at any point of time, you need to see many metrics together. You can't see metrics in isolation because they don't make sense. And the
Yes.
second thing I also wanted to ask you was that at what point do you do the survey, or at what point do you ask the customer happy with the resolution or not, or whether he's happy with any kind of solution that you have given?
Yes, ma'am. I think there, if you want to have a holistic feedback about customers' association to the product, right? We don't need to really define the point at which it needs to be there. It could be in any of the journey. The customer,
Okay.
from an NPS point of view, we basically look at someone who has been with us for some time and someone who is new. Is our NPS trending with respect to a new customer having a higher affinity or a higher promotion score to us as compared to a customer who's been with the product for long? This basically,
Hmm.
this cohorts gives us understanding in terms of whether the customer affinity over a period of time grew or over a period of time is stable, plateaued, or it is decreasing. If it is decreasing, what improvement needs to be done?
Then
So
you
we
go
basically,
back and you go back to your atom and
yes,
figure
ma'am.
out where exactly is the problem.
Correct.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
really
Yes.
looking at NPS as a number is not the measure, or even at that point in time, it is not. It's only letting us know to say that yeah, there has been a product market fit and the customer association to the product has been positive. But
Hmm.
is it improving has to be seen in different life cycle, right? So customer goes through a life cycle. He'll first get a registration. He'll do some transactions. He'll do some payments. Then he will have issues, or if there are any complaints that they will raise, how do you handle it? So at each part of the life cycle, how has been the customer experience gets then measured. So if we have to run a CSAT, right? CSAT typically is after resolution of any complaint
Yeah.
the customer has reported to us. But an NPS measure is something where customer has been in the life cycle at multiple points in time. Any customer, a list of customers who just got onboarded and have still not done a transaction, versus customers who've done got onboarded, have done transactions as well,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
certain set of customers who've done transactions and have made their repayments as well. Someone who's used our features that we claim to be better features onto. So it gives us the understanding to say that what we claim to be superior customer experience to the
Is
product,
it?
is it
Yeah. Is
actually
it
as well?
really superior? Hari, you really enlightened everything very systematically as you always do. If you want to give some message to the people who are listening to you, whether in the startup ecosystem or in the startup area or in any other product, what is the message that you would like the listeners to take away?
Sure, ma'am. Only one thing that typically I that's close to the service part that we give. The person who is giving the service has to be in the forefront. The CX ops element that we spoke about, right? Typically, the CX is a separate department or a function, meaning the service team is a separate, and inputs from the team gets used by a different department in terms of improving onto it. This will lead to a lot of failure in terms of communication. The person who is handling the consumer is the best person to give product input as well and improvement in the products as well. So how do we ensure that this communication is seamless becomes the strength of the
Hmm.
service strategy? That is something where small things to say that okay, meaning you don't need a service team which is sitting in a different office where your product team is sitting into a different office, right? In a startup, at least we have this agility and the size which helps us in
Hmm.
terms of having everybody together, right? Why,
Yeah.
why would a startup have this benefit is because somebody who is answering the consumer call or seeing the consumer failures onto it is going and giving that input into the product so that the product can build, right? As scale and size grows, how do we
Yeah.
structurally define to ensure that that input is going into the product
Back.
is
Hmm.
defines the success of the service strategy? That would be my simple submission.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So thank you so much, Hari, for your time, for your experience, and again, once again, I'm repeating for taking us systematically through how you have done your setups. Thank you so much, Hari.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for this discussion. Happy to have shared this. We've learned a lot from you, and it is basically a time of sharing it back with you. And thanks.
Oh, so nice, and I think we might tap your resource again whenever required.
Sure, ma'am. Sure.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank
Okay.
you.